Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Frank Quinn with Heritage Ohio, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm really excited because we're covering a topic that's near and dear to my heart this afternoon. We're talking about house museums, and maybe house museums that started their life as a house, transformed into a house museum, but the stakeholders are trying to figure out what the next steps are. And so today we have Donna Ann Harris of Heritage Consulting, who has been very closely involved in this process of figuring out what is the next chapter for house museums if it gets to the point where the stakeholders have decided that it's time to turn the page and start a new chapter, as it were. So we're really excited that Donna is joining us today. And let me share a little bit about Donna. She's worked in historic preservation for 35 years. And so we like to call Donna a dual threat because she has credibility from the Main Street side of things and credibility from the historic preservation side of things. Since '04, I think it is, her firm Heritage Consulting Inc. has provided training, research, and consulting services for historic sites and commercial districts. She trains regularly on volunteer management, fundraising, heritage tourism, organizational development, all of the things that an organization needs to help guide it in the right direction. And Donna is no stranger to Heritage Ohio. She's been a friend of ours for quite a while. And in fact, she joined us, I think it was back in '09 in Lebanon, Ohio, when we did one of our Main Street trainings, and it was on volunteer development. And I remember being blown away by that training, Donna, and really looking forward to what you will be sharing with us today. Before I turn things over to Donna, I do want to let you know that there is a new edition of her book, New Solutions for House Museums. We have a special, thanks to Donna, a special discount for our webinar listeners today. We'll have a little additional information on that at the end of our webinar. Plus, we are giving away one of Donna's copies of her revised edition of New Solutions for House Museums. So as far as housekeeping goes, hopefully your internet is great today and everything comes through crystal clear. If you have any trouble, a lot of times you can solve issues by just logging out of the webinar software and logging back in. Hopefully that does the trick for you. As far as comments, questions, we have our chat box, we have our question box. Feel free to ask us questions. We'll keep track of them, and then at the end of Donna's presentation, she'll be happy to do a little Q&A. So I think I covered everything. With that, I will turn it over to Donna.
Oh, gee, thanks.
You're welcome.
Welcome. Can you hear me?
We do.
All right. Well, then I'm delighted to be here. I thank you very much for having me. Yes, I'm delighted to be back working with folks in Ohio. I appreciate the fact that in your introduction, you made a comment that I do Main Street work as well as work with historic sites, which is true. I have a kind of a practice that's mixed up in both. So, but everything that all my background is really as a preservationist, and so that's what sort of led me to write this book initially in 2007. I'm here today to talk about what I've learned, sort of the lessons learned in doing a second edition of New Solutions for House Museums, and let's just get started. Some of you may know that I wrote this book in 2007, but I'm an accidental author in the sense that I did not know that the research that I was doing would end up becoming a book. I thought I was writing a much smaller like information sheet that the National Trust could publish, but instead over time the research grew, and I'll tell you a little bit about how it ended up becoming a book. but I've been working with historic sites off and on for about 20 years now. And I was introduced to more than 250 of them in the Philadelphia area where I live today in the early 1990s. I managed a $2 million grant project to provide planning and capital grants to historic house museums, which was funded by the Pew Charitable Trust for sites in Philadelphia and the surrounding 5 counties. So in the 1990s, there was no list of the historic sites in the Philadelphia area and in those 5 counties. There wasn't any, marketing of them as a group. They were just all out there trying to market themselves to visitors and look for grants. So what we had to do was to find them and create a mailing list so that we could let all of them know that this funding program was available. And the list ended up running close to 300 historic house museums in the Delaware Valley, meaning the Philadelphia and the 5 counties surrounding. Now, what we saw was that most of them were run by volunteers. The vast majority of these historic sites were run by volunteers. And we could count on really basically 2 hands, 10 or so, of these house museums had any endowment whatsoever. So that was very sobering to learn in the 1990s. And I would hope that things have changed in the intervening 30 years. But in 2003, after I was working on this and had finally moved to Chicago, I moved to Chicago to run to help run the Landmarks Preservation Council of Illinois, and then I ran the State Main Street program as a state coordinator there. But by the time I was in Philadelphia in 2003, a good friend, Barb Silberman, who was then working for the Heritage Philadelphia program of the Pew Charitable Trust, asked me to help her with some research on what would eventually become a grant-funded program called the Living Legacy Project. And that project was to provide one-on-one consulting to Philadelphia area house museums that wanted to find a new use or user for their property. So in the 2 years it took to prepare this grant application, I spoke with scores of people around the country in Canada, Australia, and England to identify how some of these house museums had made the transition to a new use or user if the museum did not work any longer. I wanted to learn more about this whole issue and won a mid-career fellowship from the James Marston Fitch Charitable Foundation in 2003. The fellowship paid for me to undertake travel and research to create 5 case studies on house museums that had made a transition to a new use or user. And all of these case studies and others ended up in the book that I eventually decided to write. Although the outcome of my research for the mid-career fellowship would help me write one of those information sheets about other historic sites, when I finished writing the case studies, they ended up to be about 100 pages. And I actually found them fascinating reading because they were essentially a narrative, a short story, for want of a better case, describing really how did they come to the decision that they needed a new use or a new user for their historic site. What was the process like? What kind of paperwork did they need? Who did they have to get permissions from, et cetera, et cetera. So the other information I had to include for my grant to the Fitch Foundation was what would be this information sheet. Well, that ended up being about 90 pages. And, the most it really should have been was 45. So my friend Barb Silberman said, that's really a book. 100 pages case studies, 90 pages of sort of background material, and that you should publish it under the American Association for State and Local History co-publishing agreement with, at the time, Alta Press. So that's what I did. I submitted a book proposal. I learned about how to write a book proposal on the internet. So it eventually was published in 2007. So my hope in doing this was that by documenting how historic sites had made a transition to a new use or user, that it might give struggling historic sites a way forward themselves. Now, the book came out the same week as the as the second KICUT conference held at the Rockefeller Brothers Estate in Tarrytown, New York in April 2007. At that conference, I was asked to provide a brief overview of my research at that meeting, and I had some books to sell. I learned months later, after the book was out for a while, that some people really fundamentally rejected the basic premise of the book, that troubled historic sites needed other options. Just limping along as a failing house museum was not a viable future in my mind. But these, we'll call them deniers, for want of a better term, just wanted the house museum to remain as is. They wanted the board to just get better at the poor job they were already doing, seeing the house museum decline. Others still were worried that the book, by providing alternatives for weak house historic sites to pursue other options, might cost them their jobs. It was clear to me that any executive director that was charged with the responsibility of raising funds, dealing with peeling paint and outdated exhibits might want to know about other ways of looking at their properties. Being able to sell your board on a radical remake of a troubled historic site, well, yeah, that's for the very brave, I'll admit to that. And I want to tell you about 5 very brave historic sites in a minute as part of my case studies for the presentation today. But what I expected and hoped would happen as a result of the book was that a lot of weak and tired historic sites would go out of business. Their collections would go to another historic site, they'd be deaccessioned, that the proceeds of the sale of their buildings would be turned over to community foundations to be used for grant purposes for other preservation activities. And I thought there would be massive amounts of new funding available for more preservation work. Perhaps the sale of one historic site could become a cross subsidy or create an endowment for another historic site through these grants funds. Needless to say, that didn't happen. There were no massive sales of historic house museums, even with the Great Recession. What I did learn from my interviews to update the case studies for this new edition was that what seemed to trip up most sites that were considering a transition to a new use or user were the uncertainties surrounding deaccessioning collections contained in the house itself. The money and time needed to go through a quality deaccessioning process just seemed to be too hard, too much, too difficult, and way too expensive. And it couldn't be done in secret. All these historic sites thinking about mergers or sales of their property would have to involve attorneys. They would have to involve their board, telling the community why they were deciding to sell their property or merge with another historic site. And they would need to be involved with the Attorney General, which has the oversight of all nonprofit corporations in the particular state. But what we found over the last 10 years or 12 years was that house museums took another route and decided to reinvent themselves, which I think was a really, really good thing. What I wanted to talk about today in this talk was what I learned from the historic sites that I profiled over the last dozen years. They learned a lot, as far as I was concerned, far more than I had expected. My publisher asked me to go and interview the case studies. There were 14 in the first edition. And it was really an eye-opener to find out what these organizations that had already made a decision that they should have a new use or user for their historic house, their former or current house museum. And they all, in one case or another, decided to buck the status quo and try something new. So I'm going to talk about these 5 solutions because I believe these particular owners really have the most to teach us about these alternatives. In all but one of these 5 case studies, the historic house museum ends up with at least one building used as a house museum, but the user is somebody new. All of these 5 case studies I'll talk about have created financially sustainable outcomes for that initially troubled historic site. And in the case of one property that gets sold to a new private owner with easements, the house gets sold to a preservation-minded buyer who really has done a superb restoration job. So let me introduce you to the 5 solutions to you now. The historic sites in the last 10 years that seem to have fared the worst during the Great Recession and in the years right after it were those that were actually in public ownerships. The National Trust for Historic Preservation named America's state parks and state-owned historic sites to its 2011 list of America's 11 most endangered historic places. Most of you know that the National Trust uses this annual list to highlight important examples of our nation's architectural, cultural, and natural heritage that are at risk for destruction or irreparable damage. In their press release about the 11 most endangered sites that year, the National Trust said, in response to record-breaking deficits, state governments are cutting funding for state-owned and managed parks and historic sites from coast to coast. State park system welcomed an estimated of 725 million visits every year and include places of national significance, from Native American historic sites to Revolutionary War forts, Civil War battlefields, and country estates. The thing about these state agencies is that manage these historic sites is that they're government entities trying to live within mandated budgets. They don't get too emotional about change, like so many nonprofits actually do. So government just goes ahead and does what's needed and lives with the consequences. These agencies have civil servants like John Adams and Rhonda Hunter, who worked at the Heritage, who headed the Heritage branch in British Columbia, Canada. Their jobs over 2 years, from 2002 to 2004, were to create and implement an exacting and, for them, successful effort to devolve, that's the term that they use in Canada, all of the 30 historic sites owned by their province of British Columbia. So their job was to find new users and new users for all of these 30 historic sites that was owned by the province of British Columbia. Now, what they decided to do was that these sites were offered through an RFP process for 15-year licenses, which, leases basically, to nonprofit organization, tribes, local government, and to private sector bidders to operate them as historic house museum visitor attractions. So the use would remain the same. All the objects, collections would remain inside, but the province would still own the building and own the collection. They were just looking for a manager and somebody that was going to open up the property to visitors. Most of them were opened during the season, like April to October. So it took 2 years to go through this process. And after John and Rhonda were done with this exhausting work, they both retired. So for the new edition, my publisher wanted me to revisit all the case studies to see what had happened. So Richard Lindsay, who runs the Heritage branch in British Columbia now, said that some of their devolved historic sites just couldn't be operated without public subsidy. Of the 30 historic sites that they devolved to nonprofits and for-profit license holders in 2002 to 2004, 8 of them, primarily the largest ones, here you see Barkerville Town and Park, which is a gold mining town in Barkerville, British Columbia, and another large property, Fort Steele Heritage Town, which is a 19th century village in Fort Steele. They needed annual subsidies, substantial annual subsidies. Barkerville, pictured here, needs upwards of $1 million each year, and the agency has returned to subsidizing all of these 8 property, which takes up 2/3 of Mr. Lindsay's yearly budget. Here's what he told me. Over the last decade, these 8 provincial historic sites have also received funds to address deferred maintenance to the order of $30 million. That's what they needed total. But he was delighted that now all of them are back on a routine cyclical maintenance footing. The staggering needs and the ongoing commitment to these provincial properties have made the agency reconsider how to fund and manage their most important historic sites. They learned that even if they lease properties to others to manage as historic house museums, that the provincial government still needs to offer annual subsidies for and operating expenses as well as for capital repairs. Another state-owned agency that runs historic properties is the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission in my home state here in Pennsylvania. And they took a very different tack when continuing to subsidize the historic sites they own, but they've leased others for use as historic house museums. Over the last 30 years, a succession of managers of the Bureau of Historic Sites and Museums at the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission went through 3 rounds of reviews to their network of historic sites in the Commonwealth to reduce costs. In the 1970s, this agency had a network of 60, yes, 60 historic sites that they owned, managed, and opened for public visitation. These reviews took place in the early 1980s, in 1997, and again in the midst of the Great Recession in the years 2007 to 2009. These reviews winnowed down their network from 60 to 13 statewide and nationally significant sites that the PHMC now owns and administers today. These reviews identified that some of the state-owned historic sites were only of local or regional significance. These historic sites were leased to local nonprofit organizations, municipalities, or leased to other users for other purposes. The state agency provides no operating subsidies to any of these sites, but will replace roofs or make capital improvements if needed. 9 of the historic sites were turned over to existing Friends of organizations under short-term management agreements, which they call associate agreements. Brenda Regal, who's the current head of the Bureau of Historic Sites and Museums of the PHMC, has worked hard over the last 7 years to boost the organizational and fundraising capacity of these 9 associate sites. Her bureau has developed a very useful and rigorous set of educational workshops and one-on-one trainings every year to help build these organizations into stronger and better funded historic sites. The Bureau has focused on developing these organizations so that they can meet basic museum standards for governance, disaster planning, and financial management. And a better museum experience for visitors is their ultimate goal. They also promote these 9 sites, associate sites, in all of the marketing materials that of the 13 sites that they still own, operate, and manage. One of the case studies I profiled in the first edition was the historic Adams House in Deadwood, South Dakota. And I was delighted to learn that continued tourism interest has spawned the creation of Deadwood History, Inc., a new umbrella organization to provide day-to-day management of now 4 house museums in Deadwood. They are the historic Adams House, pictured here, the Adams Museum, which is downtown, the Days of 76 Museum, which was newly created in the last dozen years, and the Homestead Adams Research and Cultural Center, also being, that one was being discussed and beginning to be developed when I talked with them the first time for the first case studies in about 2004. All of these historic sites are used as tourist attractions, and now they use a co-stewardship agreement to allocate funding and activities between the owner of all 4 of these properties is the city of Deadwood, and the managers, the Deadwood History, Inc. In their co-stewardship agreement, the city and Deadwood History divide up the tasks necessary for running a quality historic site, each by doing what they do best. Government knows how to and has the staff to do routine maintenance, cut the grass, etc. The city owns and maintains all the buildings, but the nonprofit partners, the Days of 76 Museums and the Adams Museum and House, own the collections and the small endowments that both of them have. As the historic Adams House was considering a new strategic plan in 2010, their consultant quickly realized that the creation of an umbrella organization to manage all 4 of the historic cultural organizations in town would be the best future for these historic sites in the city and allow them to market them in a way that would encourage more visitation than each of them could probably gather individually. So these these nonprofits, 4 nonprofits, were combined into a new oversight organization. Carolyn Weber, who's the executive director now of Deadwood History, said that the unique co-stewardship arrangement continues and works very well. Deadwood History knows how to run programs for kids and events and offer a quality exhibit and interpretation at their museums. Visitation there has soared. In this co-stewardship agreement, the costs are divided 50-50. The city provides a subsidy of half of the cost to run the operations. In this case, the money comes from gambling revenue, one of the few places in the United States where they are permitted. In this particular case, Deadwood, the city of Deadwood, keeps all of its own gambling revenue. Although in the 12 years since the book was initially published, the amount of gambling revenue has declined slowly over those years. But Deadwood History, that runs all 4 of these historic sites, charges admission. They sell tickets to seasonal and special events. One of their biggest events is a ghost tour. They sell sponsorship. They host fundraising events, and they receive endowment from. They receive money from their small endowment. In 2006, when I first wrote about the Historic Adams Museum for my Fitch-funded fellowship, they had an operating budget of about $636,000 and a visitation of about 45,000 visitors a year, which is actually pretty big for any historic site. Now today, Deadwood History has a $1.1 million operating budget, half of which the city provides, and they manage 4 museums and archives. They employ 11 full-time people and 13 seasonal or part-time staff. And their visitation has gone up to now from 45,000 10 years ago. It's now up to about 65,000. 3 of the 4 facilities are open year-round. So for them, growing bigger has made them more successful and more sustainable. And that was the lesson that they learned from the last 12 years. We all know that change takes time, especially for historians. That's my little joke. But the National Trust for Historic Preservation has worked for over 10 years, a decade, to create a shared use for the Cooper Molera Adobe in Monterey, California. For more than 40 years, the National Trust leased the Cooper Molera Adobe to the California State Park Systems through 2 20-year leases. The trust received a small endowment for the property when it was donated to them in the 1950s. They would get through a bequest. So this $50,000 endowment that they got was turned over to the park system to pay for part of the cost for restoration of the property when it first opened to the public in the 1980s. So during the recession, the Great Recession, the park system decided to pull out of their long-term lease agreement with the trust and turn Cooper Molera back to the National Trust in 2007. When that happened, the trust they didn't have any endowment left for this property. They didn't have a state lease. They didn't have any sustainable sorts of funding for operations because they hadn't run this property, for almost 40 years. And the state and the buildings needed major rehabilitation work. Several of them had, through the earthquake, had never been really fully repaired. And given this, the trust recognized that the future of the Cooper Molera Adobe was really precarious at best. The trust first considered offering all 5 of the historic buildings on the 2.5-acre walled property located in downtown Monterey to commercial developers who would use them for income-producing uses. That didn't go over particularly well with local preservationists who really wanted to see some kind of public access and interpretation of the historic buildings. This brought further conversations and with local stakeholders, and eventually an idea for a shared use was developed, where 2 of the most important historic buildings, the Cooper and the Diaz Adobes, they were the smaller buildings on the campus, would be used as historic sites, traditional house museums, while the other buildings on the property would be rehabilitated by the trust and then leased to for-profit operators who would enter into a master lease and provide a percentage of their profits to the trust. These subs would be used for overall upkeep and maintenance of the restrooms that everybody used on the property, and beautifully manicured grounds and gardens that all of the tenants would use through a coordinated schedule. The Barns at Molera, seen here, is a highly popular and successful catering venue. Well, that was pre-COVID. And a portion of the revenue generated by these businesses support the programs and exhibits at the Cooper and Diaz Adobes. As the master leaseholder, the National Trust chose wisely some highly qualified business people as operators for the new restaurant, the event center, which is the Barns at Cooper Molera, and a bakery cafe that used the other buildings on the grounds. Another building seen here is the Alta bakery at Cooper Molera. So finally, this $6 million project is now complete in 2019, and all of the components of the complex are open and operating in this prosperous downtown district. The catering operation has been very, very successful, again, pre-COVID. But what the trust learned is that they needed to work with the stakeholders to come up with a reuse plan that could satisfy everybody. It couldn't be just about them. They had to include their neighbors, local preservationists in the decision making. And this work takes time. All told, the work from 2007 at the end of the lease with the state park system to the opening date for the shared use concept in 2019 was a long 12 years. So change really does take time. And finally, sometimes returning a historic site to its original use is really finally the best idea. This is Cliveden in the Germantown section of Northwest Philadelphia. It's owned by the National Trust under a co-stewardship agreement with the local organization called Cliveden Inc. It was built in 1763 and was the site of the 1777 Battle of Germantown, where Washington lost hundreds of men to Sir William Howe of the British Army. And across the street is Upsala, this building, which was built after the Battle of Germantown in 1798 to 1801. The Johnson family owned this property until 1941, when they lost it at a tax sale. Soon after, there was a fire, and the property was set to be demolished. Local preservationist Frances Ann Wister purchased the house and formed Historic Upsala Foundation, which operated the property from 1944 until about 2000. The Historic Upsala Foundation began discussions that year, 2000, with Cliveden across the street, and finally, in 2004, a merger was struck. Basically, the visitation at Upsala had declined so precipitously over the years that they were lucky if one year they would have 10 or a dozen visitors come to visit the site. So the ladies that ran Historic Upsala realized that they needed another option. So looking across the street, they saw that Cliveden was doing well and started having a conversation with them. But it took 4 years for a merger agreement to finally be struck. So what would happen would Upsala would be programmed for use as staff offices, collections, storage, meetings, and events. So it wouldn't be set up as a house museum. And after acquiring the property, Cliveden began to seek grants to pay for roof repairs and other deferred maintenance. But Cliveden really underestimated the financial needs of the mansion, which were far larger than initially thought during the merger discussions. Over the years, in the 10 years between books, Cliveden rented out some of the first floor rooms to other nonprofits, but the rental income was really not enough to pay for operating costs for Upsala, let alone any restoration costs. But years went by. More maintenance was needed every year. And in the spring of 2013, the property was subject to a class project at the Historic Preservation Program at the University of Pennsylvania, where their class produced an archival research and architectural investigation of Upsala, which included cost estimates to address some of the maintenance or all of the restoration and maintenance need. So it really was a staggering number, millions of dollars that were needed to restore this building. The class made a presentation to the community, which is the first time that neighbors understood the condition and costs of the restoration of this particular landmark. They hadn't known in the meantime before. And then in 2000, late in the year 2013, someone made an unsolicited offer to buy Upsala for use as a private home. This was really rejected out of hand, but it got the National Trust and Cliveden talking about what really should happen to Upsala. After a few months, they decided that they would issue an RFP to anyone to seek reuse ideas for Upsala. The RFP was issued in September 2005. Again, it took, a year and a half to complete that RFP, which sought two things from the potential user. They were going to transfer Upsala to a preservation-minded buyer who was able to repair and maintain the property, and to assure its permanent protection and preservation. They wanted to place a facade easement which would include public access to the grounds for the annual Battle of Germantown, which was held on the grounds there. And they publicly circulated this RFP very, very widely. As it turned out, there were only 3 submissions, and none of them were financially viable, and none of them could pay for the easement endowment, about $50,000, that was required for the sale. The trust in Cliveden quickly reached the conclusion that the property would be offered on the local real estate market, subject to the facade easement that was so important to them. The property was on the market for a few months before this young couple submitted an all-cash offer of $550,000. The house was on the market, the offer price was $499, if I remember correctly, which included funds for the easement endowment. So it took 10 years for Cliveden, which managed Upsala, the former house museum across the street, to reach the conclusion that Upsala should revert back to a family home. David Young, who was the former executive director of Cliveden, said that they came to this conclusion after the RFP came up with very, very weak submissions. They turned to the local real estate market to see if they could find a buyer who had enough money to purchase the building and provide the endowment needed for the easement agreement. These 2 young people have done really a splendid job restoring this building as their home. They're highly community minded, and if you want to follow their progress, they have a nice Instagram page called Historic Upsala. In our last few minutes together, I wanted to reinforce some of the key points here. So even when governments decides to lease out their historic property, they still retain an obligation to maintain them and assure that the management entities are well trained and have the capacity to offer good quality visitor services if they're going to be used as visitor attractions. We've seen that in Pennsylvania and British Columbia, the state of provincial owners of these sites still must invest in their historic sites to maintain the government's original investment. A shared use that combines both for-profit and nonprofit activities at a historic site can work with highly qualified for-profit partners that share the financial responsibility for the overall operation of the complex. Cooper Molera needed a for-profit partner to generate substantial revenues to pay for ongoing maintenance of the entire historic site that all visitors enjoy today. Growth by creating an umbrella organization to manage multiple historic sites can create a stronger future for all the sites and museums. Deadwood history has shown that expansion can generate sufficient revenue to maintain these historic sites when coupled with regular, predictable funding source, here, gambling revenue, which is supplied by local government for their half of the operating expenses. And finally, sometimes the original use as a family home is the best use for a historic house. Upsala's restoration needs were just too far and too large for Cliveden to handle, one grant at a time. And so a private sector owner who had the financial wherewithal to pay for the desperately needed restoration, and they're the ones that are assuming all the responsibility. And they've also assumed the responsibility to maintain the perpetual easement requirements over time. So I'm happy to answer your questions about these properties. I did want to refer you to the other handout, which is an order form. The publisher of my book, Roman and Littlefield, has been kind enough to offer my people that are interested in it a 30% discount. If you can use the form that they have, you can also call them. They've got I think a 1-800 number. But if you go on their website, they're going to charge you the list price. So I'd encourage you to use the order form to order the book. They print on demand, which is fascinating to me. And you'll get the book in about 10 days. So I'd love to have your questions.
Great, thank you, Donna, and thank you for supplying that discount information. So yeah, please send your questions or type your questions into the question box and let us know what you're thinking. Do have a question from Alex. He is wondering, how much money did that couple spend fixing up Upsala?
Okay. They spent money initially to put on a new roof, so it's over 200,000 was their initial investment in the property. They're now doing things on the interior like restoring balusters, things that they can do themselves that don't require having a contractor. So their all cash offer of 550,000 was, as David Young put it, came in at the 8th inning of the ball game, so that nobody thought that someone would actually show up with an all cash offer, but they were delighted. And they've been unbelievably good stewards to that property.
Right. So I'm curious. I know I've done a little bit of reading in the museum field, and it seemed like visitation attendance continued to trend downward, unless you're one of the big museums like Colonial Williamsburg, something to that effect.
And even they have had very serious declines in attendance.
Is that still the case in general, attendance numbers?
Yes, sadly.
And what advice would you give to a courthouse community in Ohio, maybe 25,000 folks in the county seat, and someone has just come up with the great idea that the abandoned Queen Anne house, why don't we open it up as a museum for the
community?
One of the town's founding fathers who had a career in dentistry, and they've got 100 years worth of dental implements. What would be your advice?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. If there's any possible way that the property could actually be purchased by local government, so that at least local government would have a stake in the future of that site. Government is by and large, a pretty good manager of their real estate. So that would be the first thing that I would offer. And these co-stewardship properties, like there's I think I've got 3 of them in the second edition of the book, where government, the Emmett Till Interpretive Center in Sumner, Mississippi, they have 2 properties. One is the county courthouse, where Emmett Till's trial was held in 1955, and that was restored by the county, but the Till Center was the one that put together all of the grant applications and et cetera, to pay for all of the restoration money, but still the property was owned by the county. But it's an integral part of their interpretation of their historic site, of the Emmett Till story. So if you can have at least one partner where somebody else owns the building rather than the nonprofit, that at least gives you a leg up. And then if there are ways, particularly large rambling property and it's got wings to it, maybe there could be an apartment created for a resident caretaker, so that the property has 24-hour security. That would be another thing to consider. And really, the only time that ever happens is when the first moment when the property gets transferred to a new entity, and they're thinking about all the restoration that's needed. That's when you're going to put an apartment in for a resident caretaker. Um, but for a local organization to take on the burden of restoring a property that, unless it's in pristine condition, that's a hard sell today. It's not to say that new historic house museums aren't being created every day, because they are. And I've actually consulted with clients that are creating house museums. So I'm not the anti-house museum lady at all. But it's just such an enormous financial burden, for a small organization to undertake. But there are some that are hell bent on it, and good for them. Go for it.
Right. I've got a comment here from Caitlin. Caitlin says, "Thank you, Donna. Ideas from your first edition have been presented to our board and at Buildings and Grounds Committee at our organization. Discussion was overwhelmed by strong personalities/emotions, and everyone was overwhelmed. I think we need a consultant if we ever attempt to discuss this again. Do you have any suggestions where we can find someone who can handle all these ideas and options and emotions?"
Yeah, that's the emotion is really the hardest one to tackle, because there are people that are going to be on your board that will say things like, "You're not selling this building over my dead body," for example. Or that they don't want to be in the grocery store and have somebody that knows that they're on the board saying, "What are you doing talking about, leasing this building or selling it or having a new use?" Nobody really wants that. So, there are several other consultants around the country that do this work that I think very, very highly of. So please email me at this email address, and I'll be happy to give you their names. I agree that it's hard. It's a very, very hard discussion to have, particularly if the organization really is limping along and nobody wants to confront the reality that you basically can't afford to maintain the building any longer. But there are certainly, a lot of the historic sites that are doing better are ones that have figured out how to make their site more relevant for people that live in the neighborhood and in the community. And those are the ones that basically have reinvented themselves, primarily focusing on developing programs that really meet the needs of local community members. That maybe they have developed partnerships with the local school system or with other nonprofits in the community, that where they can rely on certain sponsorship or program revenue from those sites. So maybe some of these options, there are 10 solutions in this second edition of the book. Maybe some of them are just too hard because they require attorneys, they require getting permission from the Attorney General, but there are some of the ideas don't really require that kind of level of intervention. I mean, maybe the property could be converted into a study house, or maybe you could lease the property on a short or long-term basis to another user that would use the property as a house museum. So there are sort of levels of degree in this book. Obviously, the most significant changes would be a sale of the property to a new owner or user. But one of the sales is to another stewardship organization, Casa Amesti, also in Monterey, actually across the street from Cuba Molera, Adobe. But in the case of of Casa Amesti, the National Trust, who is the owner there, they finally decided to sell that to the organization that had been using it so successfully as basically a private dining club for years. And there were other museum rooms in that property that they were very keen on maintaining. So there's an easement on that property as well as an endowment to pay for annual maintenance and restoration of those museum rooms.
Mm-hmm. Have a question here. It's kind of along the lines of which child is your favorite, but Lynn is asking, what is your favorite historic house museum? And she says, I'm asking to get at whether there are specific themes or topics that are working well right now in terms of how you do historic house interpretation.
Okay, is that Lynn Calamia? But
You got it.
okay. You know, I don't have a favorite house museum. I have ones that I think are doing an excellent job interpreting their historic sites. And one of my favorites is the Tenement Museum in New York City. And the reason why I like them so much is because they they interpret, I think it was at 96 Orchard Street, for all the waves of immigrant groups that lived there over time, and right up until the property they purchased the property, and in the 1980s, I believe. And the other thing that I like so much about it is that they do a lot of programming around citizenship and English as a second language. And is there any other way that we could be more relevant to people in the neighborhood, which is basically part of Chinatown, than doing things like helping people, tutoring people in English and helping them with their citizenship exams? I think it's terrific.
Great. Beth says, great presentation, Donna. How important is it for historic house museums to attract school children and families, and what are good ways of doing it?
Okay, you can do a lot of programming around families, particularly if there are hands-on activities that you can offer, so that people are not being basically lectured to. If you can also employ reenactors to talk about, either farm activities if you've got a house, or maybe if your property was saved by a particular, or tells a story about a particular owner, let's say that dentist, the town founder who's the dentist. Maybe you have somebody that can do reenactments or do stories in costume about early dentistry. Might be interesting to have for kids. With regard to attracting schools, the whole issue about busing kids, or the cost for busing kids to your site, is really one that's very difficult to overcome. There are, at least in Philadelphia, there are a couple of foundations that will pay for that kind of expense, which is like $450 per bus to bring kids to bring kids to a historic site for a half a day program. And the other alternative is to develop traveling trunk programs where the historic site goes to the classroom to discuss, the themes surrounding what your site does, integrated into classroom lesson plans for the curriculum for your particular state or school district. So either way, I mean, it may be necessary because of the cost to bus children into the site that you have to go to them. And that's actually a good thing. And you probably could charge a modest fee for that. Again, modest, but at least
Mm-hmm.
that way you can get people to understand that your site is there. Maybe you offer discount coupons for them to come and visit, or have special programs that are just specifically to get kids to bring their parents with them to see the historic site.
Mm-hmm. And Donna, I don't remember if this was in your first edition, But are you aware of the Inn at the Republic in New Carlisle, Indiana, up there in northern Indiana?
No, I don't. Tell me the name of the site.
I believe it's called the Inn at the Republic. And so this was a case where it was a historic Italianate house, trying to figure out what to do with it. It had been a museum,
Uh-huh.
a local group of very dedicated individuals. They were having trouble from a financial standpoint. And what they decided to do was to maintain museum space on the first floor, but then convert the second floor into like bed and breakfast rooms or suites.
Excellent.
So, yeah, so it was a hybrid bed and breakfast slash museum. And as far as I know, I think they're still operating.
Yeah, well, the thing about having two uses is that in a historic site is certainly the upstairs uses have to have secondary means of egress. So you'd have to involve, architects to be installing that kind of thing in the property. And being able to furnish it and have somebody who's solely dedicated to marketing the property so that the turnover is enough to generate enough revenue to support the organization. I mean, I think that's very inventive. Good for them.
Hmm. Great. So I believe I saw in chat that Joyce went ahead and dropped the link to enter our drawing and to win the free copy of Donna's book. Oh, Joyce says it's the Inn at Old Republic in New Carlisle, Indiana.
Okay.
So that's what it's called. So maybe if you're ever up in northern Indiana on a road trip or something, you can check it out.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for telling me about it.
Sure, sure. I don't see any more questions coming in. I'll give folks just a moment if they have any last minute questions. Otherwise, I will remind everyone attending today that we have our next webinar coming up on Wednesday, January 27th, starting at 1 o'clock. And we are looking at influencer marketing. So we're going to focus on training organizations to work with influencers, how they can be effective, how they can benefit destinations, and how we can set up effective partnerships with them. We'll also be sharing the Ohio Tourism Office's co-op advertising program and maybe how that could help local businesses and local Main Street programs. So I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you very much to Donna for joining us today. Great presentation. I am looking forward to getting my own copy of the book and reading through it. And I'd like to thank all of you attendees for joining us today. And I guess, hey, we all made it to 2021, and here's to great preservation successes in the future. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye now. Thanks again.
Bye.